Hi, everyone. Prinhanda. My name is Fookes, Councillor Fookes. I always forget that. I only got elected in May. I'm a parliamentary candidate for Monmouth, just selected in December, and I'm really delighted, thank you, really delighted to be here chairing this, what's going to be a fascinating panel discussion. Mariana, please come and join us. So I'm going to introduce the panel shortly, but the first thing to say is, since my election, I'm Cabinet Member for Equalities in Monmouthshire, and what I've noticed, as we all have, any of us in any elected position, or any of us in all of our walks of life, spiralling inflation, the cost of living crisis, interest rates going through the roof, all these issues, all these problems caused by the Tories in Westminster have meant that poverty and inequality is increasing everywhere we look. And so I'm really pleased that we've got this panel here today to talk about our pathway to power in terms of poverty and inequality. What are the next Labour government going to do about it? What are the key things, the actions we can take, the things we're going to do to solve, to reduce inequality and poverty? So I'm delighted to be joined by these incredible speakers. I'm going to introduce them all in turn just before they speak. They are only allowed to speak for 4 minutes, especially as we are now running late. So then there will obviously be a chance for you all to ask questions. So I'm going to start with Jonathan Ashworth MP. He's Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. He was going to be online. I'm just so delighted that he's here in person. He's MP for Leicester South, and he's been MP there since 2011. So over to you, Jonathan. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Do I need to press a button or something like that?
I think it'll just come on.
Does it automatically? Shall I stand up? But well, first of all,
sit down.
Oh, you want me to sit down? Right.
Sorry, the online people won't be able to see you.
Oh my gosh, they'll just see my
your 4 minutes
my tummy, which isn't terribly flattering from my point of view. I'm absolutely delighted, as always, to be here at the Fabian Society. I've been coming to this conference pretty much off and on for well over 10 years, and it is interesting that the way in which the mood of the conference has changed, certainly in the last 4 or 5 years. I was here at the conference in January 2020, and it felt like a funeral or a wake in some ways. And I think the sense of excitement and the sense of a buzz about an interesting policy agenda opening up, and although I wasn't here for Rachel's speech, various different delegates at the event have mentioned Rachel's speech to me. I just think it is a world away from that conference in January 2020. And I think it is really important that we continue to discuss ideas and policies, because, as Richard Crossman said, who was, of course, involved in the Fabians back in the day, and I may slightly get the quotation wrong, but you get the gist. He talked about when Labour governments go wrong, it's because they've lost the maps to follow. And I think the Fabian Society is there to ensure that the next Labour government has the maps for tackling social justice. So I want to start with something which I think should be self-evident to all of us in this room, but is worth repeating, and that is this. Equality need not be etched into the landscape of our country. That poverty and the size of destitution that we are seeing is completely unacceptable, and we can do something about it. And that is important that we remind ourselves of that, because we on the left, or the centre-left, whatever label you prefer to associate yourself with, fundamentally believe that, whereas those on the right feel that inequality is a necessary condition of society, and in many ways they consider inequality as a spur for the poor to lift themselves out of poverty and so on. It's absolute nonsense, but I think it's important that we underline that, because that in itself impacts on the policy priorities of a Labour government and the policy priorities of someone like me, who aspires to be the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. Let's just remind ourselves of the stats, which are devastating after 12, now 13 years of Conservative government and anaemic growth. We've got 1 million more people in poverty. The old deal, where if you went to work, you would lift yourselves and your families out of poverty, has broken down, because in-work poverty is on the increase. 1/3 of children are in poverty, 4 million children. There's 500,000 children destitute. That means that they cannot afford, or their families or carers cannot afford food, cannot afford heating, cannot afford basic toiletries, and cannot even afford to provide that child with a decent bed to sleep in at night. That should offend all of us on the left. But not only does it offend our sense of what is right and wrong, it is also quite obviously bad for those individuals and their well-being, but it's bad for our economy as well. We cannot get the innovative, high-growth, more productive, prosperous economy unless we are tackling these levels of inequality and poverty in society, which is why we believe that we have to look anew at our social security system, and we have to look at reforming our universal credit system in order to give people decent standards of living and give people platforms from which they can flourish. So we are looking at the reforms that we need to introduce, and we are looking at the very punitive, pernicious aspects of that system, like the elements of the system that force people to wait 5 weeks and get into huge debts with the DWP before they're given their basic payments. Like the government say it's all because of a computer system. Well, back in the day, you used to fill in a form. It went to a processing centre in Blackpool, usually, particularly if you're from the north or the Midlands of the country, and you'd get your first payment, your gyro, within 10 days. Now, under the Tories, they tell us a computer system means you have to wait 5 weeks. But even within that, there are still punitive complexities in that system, which mean that people are worse off. We have a system deliberately designed to punish families. We've got a system that, in its deliberate design, prevents women, because it's often women, shouldn't be, but it is often the women, who cannot go to work because of the way in which the childcare element of that system operates. Housing costs, we know, are a huge barrier, and we need to look at this, although it's not straightforward. Not even Beveridge could fix the problems with housing in the benefit system, but nonetheless, it's something that has to be confronted. The second thing we do need to do, just very quickly though, is we also have to have a system that does help people move into work, and we've been talking about this in the last few weeks. You know, we've got 2.5 million people out of work for reasons of sickness. We've got more and more older workers leaving the workplace. Employment is lower than it was pre-pandemic. We should be encouraging people and helping people to return to work, because that will grow the economy and make our economy more prosperous as well. And yet, whether it's the social security system, which disincentivises people to move into work, or the way in which we help people, our employment support system, disincentivise people to move into work. And yet, we are spending, my final point, because I can see you're anxious, my final point on the employment system, or support system, is that this country, on last year's figures, spends £20 billion a year to deliver 40-odd different employment and skills schemes, right, delivered by 9 different government departments, and yet we've got 1 million vacancies in the economy, 1 million people unemployed, and up to 1.7 million people inactive who want to work. To quote or paraphrase another, well, Bevan wasn't a Fabian actually, but to paraphrase Bevan, it takes a particular type of organising genius to be spending £20 billion and have 1 million vacancies and 1 million people unemployed and not be giving people the employment support they need, which is why we've said we should start devolving employment support away from Whitehall and into local communities so that local areas can design the types of employment support that they're needed for their local economies. So that will get people back into work, and the reforms we want to introduce to social security will tackle in-work poverty, will tackle child poverty, and create a fairer, more socially just society. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jonathan. I'm now going to come over to Lord Stewart Wood, who is on the end there, and he's a Labour Life peer, also a fellow at the School of Government in Oxford. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and I'm also delighted to be here, and also delighted to share a platform with John Ashworth. I'm really pleased that he's leading on this agenda for the Labour Party. I mean, we're in a terrible state, it seems to me, as a country. It's a betrayal of Beveridge and Attlee government where we are. But I think it's really important. The government's done lots of things wrong, and I'm going to mention some of them. I'm sure you are too. But it's really important to work out what a long-term problem I think we have in our welfare state. We've become a very service-dominated economy. Service-dominated economies have inequality much more inherent in them. Secondly, our welfare state, which originally was a mix of universal, contributory, means-tested programs, it's become much, much more, NHS aside, a means-tested, residual kind of welfare state, mopping up the problems of the labour market. And thirdly, we've been obsessed as a country with more and more deregulation, more and more liberalisation, particularly of our labour markets. Throw all that into the mix with austerity, what do you get? You get three myths that I like to think about on this. One is the myth that whenever we get a problem in our macroeconomy, in our economic life, we adjust by making things more and more flexible. There's never enough liberalisation, there's never enough flexibility. Secondly, we still maintain the narrative, as John said, that jobs that getting into job is the solid way out of poverty. Well, it's just not true anymore. It's just not true anymore. And the number of houses where 2 jobs is not way out of poverty is astonishingly high, frighteningly high. So that myth is a real mark of how broken our economy is. And the third thing is, once you get into job, the DWP, when John and I were working for Gordon Brown back in the day, 80 years ago, had this sort of orienting thing that once you get into work, it's okay because firstly, you'll have enough to live on, and secondly, you can progress up this ladder towards more and more skills, more and more income. That ladder is broken. Those ladders don't exist. So these myths continue to operate, but instead we have a welfare state that is essentially a revolving door between bad work and no work. And the progression isn't there, and the income is not there to support. Now, the way out of that, it seems to me, is it's long and hard, but I'm going to distinguish between short-term, medium-term, long-term, just very quickly. You could pick any number of things. You could pick pension or poverty. I'm going to pick 4 things, and I really recommend IPPR and Joseph Rowntree Foundation work on these issues. The four elements I think we should really prioritise. Firstly, wages not being high enough. You know, a Labour Party is prepared to say wages in this country are just not high enough. It would be a million miles away from the government at the moment, who thinks that the way to sort out inflation caused by external factors mostly is to punish people on lower middling wages even more. So wages are not high enough, and addressing that. Secondly, housing costs, John also mentioned. I mean, housing costs are 40% higher for our bottom 20% households compared to 35 years ago. Their income's only gone up about 16, 17%. So housing alone is responsible for a significant chunk of the impoverishment of the less well-off people in our country. Thirdly, childcare. As more and more families have to resort to more work, more hours, and both parents working more in order to keep their heads above water, childcare has not kept up with the ability to make that possible. And lastly, social security. We've got sticking plaster on sticking plaster now. We've got, I mean, our welfare state is in a way one big sticking plaster on the failures of our economy. We've now got these supplementary schemes like supporting energy costs and not having the fuel duty escalator being used annually. So we've got to move away from that. There's all sorts of ways we can do this. Short-term things like providing childcare costs through universal credit upfront, as John says. We have too many claiming back rather than upfront provision for the necessary cover of costs that people rely on. Increasing childcare costs and universal credit, restoring lone parent premia. These things are all important. Secondly, in the medium term, we've got to think about, and I'm glad we are thinking, the Shadow Cabinet is thinking about this, a way of having affordable childcare places, not just by giving people cash to help them buy places, but actually intervening in the industry to make sure there is a decent, professionalised industry of childcare provision. We've got to think about ways of making house price growth come down. There's interesting ideas that IPPR have, for example, about having the Bank of England target house price growth as well as inflation. So, I mean, it's worth thinking about things other than just the mantra, we need to build more houses, which always is frustrated whatever government tend to be in power. But in the long term, the really difficult thing, and I'd really like Keir, and I'm sure Keir's thinking about these issues, but Keir and the leading parts of the Labour Party, to talk about long-term changes, long-term shifts in the burden of taxation, giving people education credits throughout their working lives, which means they can skill up and actually create some ladders of progression in work. And introducing more contributory welfare in some areas, because we have to have a welfare state which is not vulnerable to the slash and burn approach the next time the Tories come into power. All these things, they might sound like pie in the sky, but actually we need to rethink the entire way the welfare state supports dignified work rather than just mopping up the mess of a long tail of low-paid work.
Thanks. You so much. Thank you. Almost well done. Thank you so much. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce Councillor Sara Hyde, who's going to talk about inequality and poverty from her perspective. She's worked for 10 years with women in prisons, is also vice chair of the Fabians, and an all-round incredible woman.
Thanks, no pressure. Right, thanks. Hello, lovely to be here. Thanks for choosing to be here post-lunch. Hope you're all doing okay and still with us in this very warm room. Thanks for the contributions. Yeah, I guess I wanted to talk about the need for boldness in our thinking. I mean, we've heard a lot today already about the challenge we've got in turning things around for a Labour victory, and I think that can be intimidating, but I wouldn't want it to limit us in any way. from boldness in our thinking, because we live at this time of great economic and increasing disparity within communities. I represent a ward in Islington where if you live on one side of the road, you have an 8-year longer life expectancy than on the other side of the road. So incredible economic disparity even in a very small area, and then the kind of economic disparity between the kind of London and South East and then the rest of the country, and how we fix and address some of those kind of problems of inequality. I feel a bit like I'm living in this Dickensian time. I don't know if anyone else noticed there was a hell of a lot of Christmas Carol productions on over the festive seasons, because the whole of the arts sector is just like, here's a big mirror, it's really bad, we've stopped being subtle now. And even one production had a whole article about food banks in their programme in case you didn't get it from watching the show. So that's kind of like where we are. So I'm going to do a kind of rattle through smorgasbord of things we can do, or things we might want to be thinking about in terms of addressing these issues of poverty and inequality. I also just want to say this morning someone made the excellent point about like inequality is not a zero-sum game. We're not living in a world with this much pie where we, if we take one person's right, if we reduce the rights of one group or the opportunities of one group, we're automatically stealing them from another. And it's great to hear Jonathan Reynolds and to hear John Ashworth this afternoon just thinking about that prosperity and growth and welfare to the benefit of the whole of society. We don't need to be pitted against each other, squabbling over scraps. We believe in collective responsibility, we believe in solidarity, and we believe in a bright hope and a future. Otherwise, why are we all here? What are we fighting for? So let's not be shy. So, my rattle through. Here we go. Use local government. Hooray, I was always going to say that. Use local government. They're the people closest to your communities. They know what is going on. We've got some brilliant, devolved government and council work going on. Work with your communities. Let's look at how we can empower our people and not be kind of paternal philanthropists in some weird old Victorian model. We've moved on since then. Lots of communities know what is best for their community, but people are so flipping tired and broken after 13 years of crap, they haven't got the energy to fight. So let's come alongside, again, in solidarity and really facilitate the kind of expertise and lived experience of our communities to help fix some of the problems at that grassroots levels in our communities that will help address the issues of poverty and inequality. So empower people by facilitating them and not being patronising to them. I'd love to see a focus on complex needs. Okay, so complex needs is a cohort of people in our society who have experienced criminal justice involvement, mental health problems, substance misuse, homelessness, violence against the person, violence against women and girls. So there's 5 categories. There's estimated about 80,000 people have experienced all 5 of those. There's a larger cohort of almost 400,000 people that have experienced 3 of the 5 elements of multiple disadvantage. If we had a serious strategy dealing with that cohort of people, that in a generation's time, our country would look completely different. We're never going to be able to just eliminate addiction or some of these very deeply entrenched things, but I've yet to see a decent strategy on tackling that cohort of complex need, or working with complex needs population. We've got to be unapologetically anti-racist. We have got to do things like implement the Flipping Lammy Review, brilliant recommendations the current government have ignored. We've got to tackle the structural issues around racial inequality, around the fact that black children are excluded at 3 times the rate of white children from our schools, that black women die 4 times more from maternal health issues, the fact that more people from ethnic minority backgrounds live in poverty at twice the rate, the fact that a black African woman is 7 times more likely to be detained when she has a mental health crisis than a white woman. That has got to be at the core of this poverty and inequality action. We've got to have an anti-racist strategy on each part of our manifesto. Finally, final random idea, unconnected to the previous one, access to food is so important. In Islington, we give our children free school meals, and the difference in those children's attainment when they're not hungry, it is basic. It is basic, and it is so devastating to live in a country where this is necessary, but we've heard about this from other speakers. Free school meals, universal free school meals, is cheaper than doing all the means testing. If children aren't hungry, they learn better, and that reduces inequality and improves educational attainment. Here are some ideas. Thanks for listening.
That was great, Sara. Thank you, and to all the speakers so far. I'm going to introduce Stewart in a moment, but just to say I've been really heartened actually by the fact that a lot of speakers today have talked about childcare, because it is a massive route out of poverty for so many. We've done some research. I'm CEO of a charity in Wales, the Women's Equality Network Wales, and we did some research into the much larger contribution to the economy investing in care makes than investing in building. So when Boris Johnson was going build, 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 we were saying no, care, 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 invest in our carers, invest in childcare. It's an incredibly important route out of poverty. Anyway, I would like now to introduce Stewart. Stewart Lansley is an academic author from Bristol Uni, I believe, and he has written some incredible books, one of which is The Cost of Inequality. So over to Stewart.
Okay, well, I want to start by taking us back a century and a half to 1884. 1884 was the year the Fabian Society was founded. And in that year, they published a pamphlet that asked 3 questions. Why are the many poor? Is our society fair and just? And if it isn't, can we do anything about it? Now, it says a lot about our society today that those 3 questions are as relevant today as they were in the Victoria era. If we look back sort of briefly about post-war history, Britain achieved peak equality and a low point for poverty in the 1970s. Unfortunately, this was an historic achievement. It was a very important point in history, but it was very short-lived. What happened after that was that if we fast forward to the present day, Britain has moved from being one of the most equal countries in the 1970s to the second most unequal countries amongst rich nations. The level of child poverty has doubled since the 1970s. And if you compare the average living standards of the poorest fifth in Britain compared with other comparable European countries, then our citizens in that bracket are between a fifth and a third poorer than their counterparts in rich European countries. Now, there are many reasons why we've ended up with this, essentially a sort of reversal of the social progress of the post-war years. The first is that in the 1980s, we switched the philosophy of government away from post-war egalitarianism to a philosophy that was essentially pro-inequality and pro-rich. The second is that as a result of that, what's happened is that the top 1% and the top 5% have essentially captured a disproportionate share of the gains from the economy over the last 40 years, and at an accelerating rate. And the third reason, which other people have talked about, is that we have the level of our social security system, our social protection system, has been weakened immensely over the last 40 years. Now, I haven't got very long, so I really want to set out, since we're really looking at what the Labour Party should be doing. A lot of us are pinning a lot of hope on Labour winning the election, but what kind of society will emerge, say, 5 years and 10 years after a Labour government? And I want to suggest 2 principles and 2 policies. The first 2, the principles are that it's time to openly declare again one of the fundamental principles of the Labour Party, which is a belief in a more equal society. Egalitarianism was actually at the heart of the Labour Party right until, essentially, until 1997. So I think it's time that everybody, we all looking for a new vision. It's difficult to believe that we can have a vision for a better society that does not end with the effect of reducing inequality significantly. The second principle is, I think we need to learn the lessons of 1945. If you look at the reasons why we achieved peak equality and minimum poverty in that period, it was because Labour introduced a number of institutional changes in the economy that sort of locked in egalitarianism and an increase in the minimum income. So they actually locked into the way the economy and the way society works instruments that were essentially pro-equality. Most of those instruments have been removed. If we're looking at the two policies, the first policy I think we need, I mean, everybody's talked about improving the social security system. I think it's time to implement what we might call a plimsoll line for incomes, a level of incomes below which nobody would fall. This would be non-means tested, guaranteed. It could be set at quite a low level. And some calculations I've done for the think tank Compass shows that even a very modest minimum income would cut poverty by 60%, and it would take us below the minimum level of poverty that was achieved in the 1970s. The second point, and I've gone on too long, is I wanted to talk about wealth and the role that wealth might... Yes, okay, thank you. Sorry, I went on a bit.
I didn't mean to finish your sentence, but anyway, thank you so much. Really good, thank you. Really interesting. I like the plimsoll line. In Wales, we're watching with interest because we've got a universal basic income pilot going on at the moment that Welsh Government have done, and it'll be really interesting to see what happens there, but I know that's different from your plimsoll line. Last but not least, I'm really delighted to welcome Councillor Mariana Masters, who is chair of the Fabian Women's, not the whole of the Fabians, I think Fabian Women's. She's a network and she's a brilliant chair, and we're really delighted to have her here to talk about some perspectives on poverty and inequality, and perhaps touching on inequalities in black and Asian and minority ethnic people in their healthcare, which I know was the subject of your last
yes. Thank you very much for the invitation, and apologies, I am cobbling together everything that I have spoken about today. Yes. I'm really happy to be here. Fabians has been a real sort of almost a spiritual home, because at its core is about justice, is social justice, and I want to talk about racial justice. Because if you look at the lens of anything we've been discussing today, whether it's education, whether it's healthcare, the actual data shows, I mean, I know it's my lived experience, but data actually shows that the outcomes for a black and minority ethnic person is that much worse. For no justifiable reason. And I think that the one thing that I would like the Fabians to do is actually to really seize this opportunity. We are obviously looking to power into government, and it can't be Groundhog Day. Because this is, I mean, we need allies, because when one of us helps another, we're not just improving, we're not just dealing with inequity, we're actually helping ultimately the wealth of our country. The more productive we can be as people, the more we can give back to society, and the wealthier we will be. So when you look at everything from productivity levels, and low wages, and you have that racial lens, you think, what's the issue here? How can we help? I think the Labour Party have some real answers to actually make people's lives better. Sara touched on all the stats in terms of healthcare. I've previously, just before this panel, chaired a panel on black health and well-being, and it was absolutely apparent that across the board, whether it was looking at mental health, whether you looked at black maternal health, whether you looked at obesity, hypertension, in fact, so many determinants that made black and minority ethnic people disproportionately have more COVID deaths than white. It was down to the fact that there were underlying issues that haven't been addressed. So my plea here, my clarion call, is that the next time that there's a Black Health and Wellbeing Fringe, they're not just a few hardcore people in the room, but there is a packed room like this, actually seizing the metal about what we do to make our society more equitable. I'll just touch on one issue that I rehashed again from this morning, where I was on a panel with a brilliant Bridget Phillipson talking about education, and I touched on my experience as a Guy St St Thomas's governor, where I'm very, very lucky in that I get to be annoying and sit on lots of committee meetings with very well-meaning people, very earnestly nodding their heads. But actually, when I ask the question, so we're in Lambeth, and I, in my councillor role, have a remit in terms of children, young people, and I can't remember when local state school kids were invited into this space so that you could demystify what happens here. Because if you ask an average, you ask a child in Lambeth, what happens in a hospital, how many jobs are there? You might come up with maybe 10, 12, there's about 350. You might think, I'm only interested in computer and video games. Actually, one of the most exciting things that's happening now is that sort of AI, space, and robotics. Our community could be so much more productive if only we knew. If you don't know what you don't know. So my first ask is, let's address racial inequality. Because it's for the good of everyone. If you can't look at, oh gosh, there's a knife crime here, and you've got to look to the causes of crime as I don't know if I'm in a safe space, but as our once dear leader said, you absolutely have to peel away all the inequality and address it. So I think I'll leave it there. I've rambled on and tried to pick and mix all the things I've been talking about, but I hope
Thank you.
We can go.
Mariana, you were brilliant as ever, and thank you so much for stepping in, because sadly Dr. Begum couldn't come, but it's brilliant to have you here. First question, I'm going to take questions in three. So, Susie, I think you are, and then the gentleman here on the left, and the lady in the orange jumper.
Hello, so my name's Susie Stride. I'm from Poplar and Limehouse, and really enjoyed people's contributions. Stewart, I enjoyed what you said. There was just one thing where you mentioned about the 97 Labour government, and I find it's become a little bit trendy. This is a question. I find it become a little bit trendy that in the left, we criticise the 97 government. As someone from the most deprived area in the country, the 97 Labour government changed my life and changed the kids that I've worked with for the last 20 years. So I think we have to be very careful as the Labour Party, because it makes us seem privileged. What? Because it didn't touch our lives, maybe because we lived in Surrey, because in East London, the 97 Labour government under Blair and Gordon Brown built children's centres, youth clubs, Future Jobs Fund, improved the NHS. Every school that was failing was lifted. And I'm just like, I'm sorry, if I see another left-wing person criticise the last Labour government, you're going to have a whole lot of working class people saying, what are you talking about, mate? This is why we're disconnected. This is why we don't win the Red Wall. So I'm not criticising you. However, everyone in this room, we need to get better on this, because we don't deserve to win the next election if we think it's okay to criticise the 97 government when they changed poor people's lives. They lifted people out of inequality. And I'm not being horrible. Jeremy Corbyn, lovely guy, didn't build a single school or hospital or children's centre or youth club. So whose lives did he change? Maybe he made a whole lot of people feel better about themselves.
Okay, I'm going to next question. Can we make? I appreciate your contribution, but please, can we make sure we have a question at the end of it, and then we're going to the lady in the orange jumper, and then I'll share those questions out. Thank you. Introduce yourself, if you wouldn't mind, and go for it.
Hi, my name is Ade. I'm based in Lewisham, but just for context, I'm the child of like two Nigerian immigrants that came in the early 90s. They came here incredibly poor. I grew up on a council estate. And I was told, if I work hard, I go to a good uni, I will get a job, I'll have great wages, I'll live a middle class lifestyle. I feel like I've been lied to. for the last 10 to 15 years. I feel like a lot of young people have been lied to with low wages, high rents. I just want to know what Labour's plan is on social mobility, aspiration, and the building of wealth in this country.
Okay, and just behind you, orange jumper.
Hi, my name's Vera Baird. I'm in Hornsey and Wood Green Labour Party. And I really just wanted to look at the issue that Stewart raised about the Plimsoll line and that you raised, Catherine, about the Welsh Government step. As I understand what they've done, they've introduced a minimum basic income of kind, we've all been talking about for a very long time without a lot of reality emerging, especially for care leavers who are immensely deprived, immensely underachieved because they're immensely under-supported. And it looks like, as long as it's wrapped around with more than just some income, a really positive step. And I wondered, Stewart, how it fitted into your notion of the Plimsoll line and whether this was, in fact, quite an effective pilot for us to follow and look for.
Okay, I'm going to go with Ade's question first around social mobility to you, John. Okay? Is that okay?
Well, I was going to ask Susie if she could just be a bit clearer in what she thought there. Get off the fence. Yeah, get off the fence, Susie. I'll leave colleagues on the platform to respond to Susie's very interesting provocation, and I think we're all keen for the platform to respond to her point. And look, this is a really, really, really important point, isn't it? And I get this. Actually, funnily enough, the Fabian Society event I did at the conference last year was exactly on this point about intergenerational fairness and the sense in which people today in their 20s and 30s who are trying to get on, who have done all those things that they were told to do, like take on huge amounts of student debt to go to university and so on, simply cannot make their way in life with a fair wage and cannot get on the housing ladder. And what do we need to do about it? Well, there's quite obviously never going to be one single silver bullet answer to any of that, but it comes to the point that Lord Stewart was making about the way in which the economy is broken and we need some long-term fixing. So we've got long-term solutions. So to deal with the housing problems, we've got to build more houses. There's problems around a system, and for the bit that I'm responsible for on the DWP, we have a job support system which pushes people into any low-paid job, irrelevant of whether it is suitable for you as an individual, and it's completely disconnected to the economic needs of a local area. So one of the things that I've been talking about is saying that rather than running the job centres and employment support from behind a desk in Whitehall, which is basically what happens at the moment, the Secretary of State effectively sits in Whitehall and decides what is the right type of employment support for London, for Leicester, for Bradford or Barnsley or whatever it is, regardless of what's needed. And then what happens is the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions puts out a contract nationally, which is tendered nationally, and a big outsourcing firm wins that contract, usually Serco or G4S or someone like that, who then provide employment training in an area, regardless of what the needs are of the area. I think that is not the only solution to these deep problems in the economy, but that I'm coming at it from the bit that would be responsible for. I think a much better system would be to sweep powers and resources out of Whitehall into local areas. So Leicester can design the employment support schemes that are needed for young people in Leicester to get good, well-paying jobs, and Liverpool can do the same, and different bits of London can do the same, and etc., etc., etc. So I think, and that speaks to this bigger argument that we're making in the Labour Party about decentralisation. Cllr, a couple of weeks ago talked about a Take Back Control bill, and a neat piece of political footwork there. But the fundamental point is, one of the reasons why our country is so unequal and it feels rigged against so many people is because of the way in which we run our economy, and we've got to decentralise. So it shouldn't just be employment support, it should be skills, it should be R&D funding, it should be a whole range of things should be delivered locally, where local communities know what is best. So that's not obviously going to be the whole answer to your particular set of circumstances, but I do think it is part of the answer.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to come to Stewart next to me around the Plimsoll line, and perhaps to address Susie's point if you would like to. It wasn't actually a question, but you can address it.
Well, I'll start with the Plimsoll line. The idea, I've called it the Plimsoll line it is actually a form of universal basic income. Now, I know that UBI is a sort of controversial issue on the left. Generally, there are people who are very keen on it and people who are against it. I think we, to understand the concept of a plimsoll loan, we need to look at the history. I mean, philosophers and thinkers have been arguing for a guaranteed basic floor for centuries. Beatrice Webb was the first person to put flesh on it in her minority report in 2010 for the Health Commission. Beveridge thought he was implementing a plimsoll line. He thought that his measures together, a mix of National Health Service, universal family allowance, and a national insurance system, would guarantee that nobody fell below a certain minimum. Well, I mean, the changes of the last 60 and 70 years, for a whole series of reasons, we do not have a guaranteed minimum income in Britain. I mean, the social security system itself, as Jonathan was saying, is highly punitive. There have been 8 million sanctions issued by the DWP since 2010, in which benefits have been taken away entirely. And this is one of the main reasons for the surge in the number of food banks. So the idea of a UBI is that we would actually set a floor below which nobody would go. So it's a little bit like child benefit is essentially non-means tested, apart from people on the high rate of tax. And it's guaranteed, it's automatic. We would extend that principle to other parts of the social security system. For example, we could introduce something equivalent to child benefit for young people, I mean, age, say, 18 to 25, who, I'm sure we all accept of having an extremely rough deal. And I think, the pilot that's happening in Wales, which is, absolutely fantastic, of course, is restricted to care leavers. So, I mean, it's great that it's happening, but I think, what we need in the Labour movement, for me, is a much bigger debate and an honest debate about this issue. I mean, it does get, rather heated and passionate at times, but I think if we're looking 10 years ahead, 15 years ahead, modern economies, which are incredibly insecure, they're low wage, that we can't guarantee decent jobs and so on, the thing about an income floor would that it would transform the nature of choice that people have and the decisions they take. Absolutely. Now, just very, very quickly I apologise, I didn't mean to say anything about, I was talking actually about the 1970s, not 1997. Yes, I mean, I agree with you entirely. The Blair government, and Brown government did a number of huge things. Particularly in terms of the introduction of the national minimum wage and great increases in public spending, which of course we've lost. What they didn't do is what Attlee did in 45, which is to lock in changes apart from the national minimum wage that were irreversible. So the NHS, the national insurance system, child benefit, and so on, all those things have not been reversed. But quite a lot of the things that New Labour did have been reversed. And I think what the lesson we need to learn is that we've got to redesign the economic system in such a way that they are pro-equality instruments that you cannot take away.
Okay, I'm going to ask a lot more questions. One there. Let's start with this person here. Keep your hands up, everybody.
Thank you so much. Emma Burnell, journalist, Fabian, playwright. We've talked about welfare and we've talked about wages. I think there's a third W that's missing from the conversation, and that's work. And what I mean by that is the quality of work. Now, before I say this, I just want to say my boss is at the back and I'm not at all talking about me. But for too many people, being at work is not nice. It's not somewhere you want to be. You are treated appallingly. And we really need to make sure that being at work, if we're going to address social mobility and we're going to address that through wages and it's not just about skills. Skills are great and that will move you into a different job, but somebody's still going to be then doing that shit job. So, as a writer, I use that word very deliberately. So how do we deal with the quality of work issue?
Okay, we're going to take 2 other questions and that's it because we are over. Is someone else supposed to be in this room now, or are we okay just to carry on 2 more minutes, Fabian organisers? Yeah. You can carry on, great. So the lady here and the red jumper and black jumper, and then I'll come back to you.
Sharon Patrick, councillor in Hackney. My question's about housing. We talk about poverty, we talk about poor health. I know Sara will know as Islington Council. I know Islington are building council houses. We are trying to build council houses in Hackney. I should say we are building council houses in Hackney. But there's no subsidy from the government. We have to only build on our own land because we can't afford to buy land. We're limited where we can build them, and we're also limited to how many we can build by what we can afford. We have to pay for them ourselves. You know, one of the ways I think of getting people the Labour government looks at is getting people out of a lot of people out of health problems, out of poverty, poor education, is to provide good social housing at affordable rents. And I don't mean 80% of the market, I mean council rents where people can afford to pay the rents, people can afford to go out to work, people don't have to rely on benefits to pay the rent.
And your question?
So what are we going to do as the Labour Party when we get into government to make sure that we build council housing that people can afford and solve a lot of the problems around poverty?
Thank you. The lady in the black jumper, and then I will just, there was a person in the, you with your hand up. Yes, after that. You go, and then we'll go there, and then I'll round up.
Thank you. I'm Lucy from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Lord will be heartened, I hope, to know that pretty much everything he put on there is very much part of our agenda for the year. So hopefully lots of things that people in this room will find helpful. My question is just about destitution specifically, and that very deep poverty that we've seen growing so much. We know the public are really concerned about the deep poverty they're seeing in their community. What is it that Labour can do to tackle that, and does that require addressing the inadequacy of the rates of social security, as many on the panel have reflected? Okay, and there's just one more question at the back, and then we'll answer. You can take one question each. You can choose which one, panel. And I'll start from Mariana, that end. Okay.
Cheers. Alex McIntyre from Gloucester. This is probably quite a topical question given the social media post this week, but how do we tackle the rhetoric from Conservative MPs like 35p Lee, who seem to think that in-work poverty is a myth?
Okay. We'll start with you, Mariana.
Okay. I think people have asked what should Labour be doing, and it was very apparent from and we all know, we're all clever enough to know that we can't fix everything all at once. The state of our economy has been crashed, but I would ask that we think about not just fair taxation, but we actually really have a new sort of social contract with business. And so we look at, we're very good, I think, at local council level to look at things like responsible procurement and to have clauses in so that contracts that we sign, we in turn expect a certain amount of apprenticeships, a certain amount of payback to the community. In my ward, we've got a partner that's running coding classes after school. And that's the way we can sort of mitigate the heavy financial costs that the party is going to be facing. A lot of corporates are aware that they have to get on board. PwC has commissioned a social mobility piece of research, and they know that from a risk perspective, if you're not engaging and employing more of your local community, you can't afford to just go and try and get low-skilled, low-cost workers from abroad. That's the tide is turning. So I would say let's have a refresh into how we can work with business so business works for us.
Brilliant, thank you. Sara?
I've been asked to think about the housing question, but before I do, I just want to say we should be talking more as a party about subsidiarity across the piece, that people closest to the decisions make them. And I think that goes to the heart of a lot of the different things we've been talking about. And thank you, John, for bringing that perspective about the kind of skills and the kind of work that we're bringing to people. So yeah, local solutions, bespoke solutions. In terms of the housing, I think there's a load of basic legislative change around how we build council houses that the current government have continued to let this kind of very punitive, local government gets all the crap and all the crap laws and nothing that's helpful. We know what we want to do as a council. It's a real struggle for us to build any council housing. We only can because we have prime London real estate that we're building on, and lots of my colleagues around the UK in different parts of England particularly, they can't build any council housing because the maths doesn't work, because they're not in central London where there's other ways that they can cut the maths basically so that it works. And we're very fortunate in Islington, we can say 50% of everything we build is going to be council housing. That's only because of that unusually privileged position of the value of the land and the airspace above it. So any future Labour government, it's not up to me, but I think we know there's some basics on the maths of council house building that central government needs to get on top of so that works nationwide. I also think, again, we just need to be a lot more creative, because we're a small, densely packed country for the most part, about things like intergenerational housing cooperatives, and just thinking in different ways about how we coexist on this island and how we thrive. And yeah, I think there's a lot more we could do in terms of creativity around housing policy, but it's very hard when the basics are so broken and there's so much overcrowding, and you have cases like the boy in Manchester who died. I mean, that's where we're at. So there's a lot of remedial action to do before we can actually start to think creatively about the next 50 and 100 years and how we live together.
Very well said. Lord Wood.
I'll try and answer all 4 questions in one go. So quickly, on Emma's question, it's a really important point about quality of work, and I'm a director of a thing called the Good Law Project, which is a campaigning organisation that we won cases up with against Uber, for example, and I think stopping the casualisation of work or undermining the disruptive casualisation of work is really important. There's all sorts of things on new job standards, on giving rights to flexible working demands that we could think about, I think, for a Labour government. I think that's a really important agenda. Sharon's question on housing. One thing we should think about, I think, we give landlords so many subsidies in all sorts of forms. We should make a condition of those subsidies, prioritising certain categories of people. And it goes back to Addie's point. On your point about the social contract, I think one way to think about this is when people hit 16, 17, 18, we should be giving them the kind of capital, the equipment, the assets to be able to live decent lives, to have dignity, to make choices which aren't just choices on the breadline. And Gordon Brown had an idea, by the way, to be critical of my own. She's still there. She's gone. Gordon Brown had a policy, baby bonds. John Ray, remember this? Where we gave every child born a chunk of money, and then it matured. In fact, my son had it. He didn't introduce it for my son. My son happened to be in the 2-year window when it existed. He redeemed it about 3 months ago. My son doesn't need that money particularly because we're pretty well off. But a lot of people did get that money. Now we should be thinking about not reviving that policy on its own, but thinking about how we can give people the ability to be not in debt when they enter adulthood, because we know that being in debt at that age is associated with all sorts of mental health issues, and housing is one of these issues, I think. On destitution, I think this is a really important point Lucy raises. Day one of 97 Labour government was about making the bank independent, New Deal, I think we should be thinking about some kind of raising of the floor for those most in need moment for our kind of day one thing. It's not cheap, and you have to... But, talking of housing, some way we've got to be able to tax people who benefit from the extraordinary housing market in our country. We've got to be able to find a way to do that, and that's partly the solution. And on how we fight 30p Lee, I mean, I actually, and maybe this is too optimistic, I genuinely think that remark about, poverty is essentially people not managing their budgets properly, Lee's obsession, that remark 20 years ago would have got much more sympathy than it does now. Because people have experienced COVID, they've experienced cost of living crisis. The cost of living crisis is particularly acute for people at the bottom of the distribution. But it goes all the way up, as we know, right? It goes all the way up to very high in the income range. The cost of living crisis is being felt by people of all sorts of income backgrounds. And the idea that somehow there isn't this thing called poverty that's hitting people, irrespective of their effort, is nonsense. So we can call it out with confidence that a lot of people are going to know that it's true now in a way I don't think was true 25 years ago.
Thank you. Stewart, and then we'll wrap up with...
Okay, well, the one point I want to make really is that, I mean, every speaker has mentioned it, in that we live in a world that's got a wrecked economy and a wrecked society. We have multiple social problems, and the public know this because a lot of them have experienced it. And this is obviously it's not a completely parallel situation with 1945 because that was sort of war-driven, but it's not that dissimilar. And this feels to me there'll only be one opportunity to really rebuild our broken society, and that will be with a Labour government. And this is an opportunity to be really radical, because I think people want radicalism. I think, there's lots of evidence now that people are much more aware of poverty. They're much more aware of inequality. They hate the way they're prepared to pay more taxes to improve public spending. And I believe if you try to sell that message that Labour will be egalitarian, it will rebuild our public services, and we will find the money, would be popular, and it would mean that we can, create a legacy of a better society like we did in 1945. So that's a kind of plea, just to be a bit more radical.
Radical. Okay, Jonathan. Round it all up for us.
Okay, right. Well, I certainly think creating a fair society where with social justice at the heart of everything we do is radical, and it's for reasons of social justice and equality that I'm in politics. And although it was very interesting on the historical perspective, I certainly know throughout our history we've always debated about whether we really were truly in favour of equality. I always think that Tony Crosland was always pretty disappointed in the attitude of some of his colleagues towards inequality, despite the way we now look back on some of those previous Labour governments. I think just a couple of things. First of all, on the quality of work, this is incredibly important. Of course it is. Susie's left, but I was with Stewart in the Treasury back in the day, and we worked for that Labour government. And one of the driving sort of attitudes of the Labour government was that in a global economy, your labour markets need to be incredibly flexible, which led to a downward pressure or a slowness in responding to what were very legitimate demands in the workplace. I was a special advisor dealing with one or two of my other special advisor colleagues, not Stewart as it happens, but one or two of my special advisor colleagues, about trying to persuade them that we should adopt various different agency worker directives and so on. So in that respect, the other Stewart is correct to point out some of the areas where we didn't get it right when we were in government. We do now need to do more on workplace rights, but it's not just about workplace rights. I think we increasingly know more now. It's obvious, really, about the connections between work, poverty, and ill health, and mental ill health. Now, I didn't know this until I became the Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary. The Department of Work and Pensions is actually responsible for occupational health. We don't have any occupational health really in this country unless you're lucky to work for a big firm who provides it. Yet we're supposed to provide people with occupational health. My department, not the department I want to run, is supposed to be organising it across the country. And what we now know is getting people into work isn't just about giving them a job and forgetting about them. It's an ongoing dynamic process. So we need to help people thrive out of work, but once they're in work, we need to help people thrive. So I'm looking at how we build proper occupational health support as well in the workplace. And finally, of course, look, adequacy of benefits, of course, is something that we are looking at. Rachel has left, but I'm sure she would find out if I made a monumental spending commitment. I mean, you could get away with it in the old days when everything wasn't on Twitter and so on, but now you have to be careful. But just the final point. Look, we cannot possibly tolerate a society where a woman turns up at a food bank in my constituency, as happened, and had to turn down fresh food because she said she cannot afford the bills associated with keeping her fridge switched on. That is going on. And that woman was in work. And that is going on in our society today. And we cannot possibly tolerate a society where a child born right now, this second, if they're born right now, this second, in poverty, whether in this bit of London or my Leicester constituency or Manchester or Glasgow, if that child born right now, because they're born into poverty, is more likely to be admitted to hospital throughout their childhood, usually for something to do with tooth decay. It's more likely to leave school obese. Is less likely to get the relevant immunisations that they need as they're growing up. Is more likely to turn to mental health services when they become a teenager. And actually, if they are very, very, very poorly, they're less likely to survive because they're born into poverty. We cannot possibly accept that at all. That is surely what we are in politics to change, and it's certainly why I'm in politics, and that's what I want to do. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and a huge thank you to all our panel. And I'm so sorry, Andy, that we've run over, but we did start late because the other one had to start late for no reason, no fault of their own. So huge thank you to the panelists and for your great questions.